With this study, we now turn to the Roman culture and the Roman Empire to see what kind of an impact Rome had on the early church. We've already seen that Jesus came into a world dominated by Greek culture. But when Jesus was born, it was the Romans who were in charge politically, and they had created a great empire. Jesus was born during the reign of the first Roman emperor, a man by the name of Octavian, who took the name Augustus. But Rome itself did not begin with Augustus. As a matter of fact, it had begun 2,000 years earlier, when a group of people called Villanovans settled in the midsection of Italy around a hill that they came to call Palatine Hill and established the town of Rome, and they spoke the language called Latin. For many, many years, these people existed as a very agrarian people, a group of farmers who lived close to the soil. They developed a culture, however, that was typical of many farming communities and people living in rural settings. They were extremely conservative. They were extremely moral. They were moral to a fault. They were strict in their morals. They were a tough people because life was not easy for them. So they learned how to survive. They learned how to be loyal, patriotic. They gave us that word, by the way, patriotic. It comes from their word father, because loyalty to the state was loyalty to the pater, to the father. They were a deeply religious people, very religious people. And it is important that we understand the moral fabric of these Roman people, because sometimes in the sensationalism of some of the later emperors like Nero and Caligula, we get to thinking of the Romans as being grossly immoral. That is not the case, because the Roman people at the root remained a highly moral, highly religious, very conservative people. They were probably not even, we might say, civilized, in the sense that they did not have cities. They were just basically farmers. But about 800 BC, they were invaded by some people who probably came from Asia Minor called Etruscans. The Etruscans had developed a civilization. They had been in contact with Greeks and Mesopotamians, and they had put together a very sophisticated way of life. They took over Rome. By 600, they were in full control of Rome. And they imparted many ideas to the Romans. Ideas about military structure and organization, about political structure, how to put a state together, how to run a state. Commercial ideas, religious ideas that they didn't have, where they saw, for instance, gods as people. We call that anthropomorphic religion. Vocabulary. Many things came to the Romans from the Etruscans. As a matter of fact, in one sense, we might say the Etruscans incubated the Romans. They made them a civilization. In time, the Romans were strong enough to overthrow the Etruscans. There's a story about how an Etruscan prince assaulted a noble Roman lady, and in vengeance for that, the Romans, a friend of her brother, a man named Brutus, drove the Etruscans out in the year 509 BC. When that happened, they set up a type of government that had never been experimented with, never been practiced before. A type of government called, well, the Latins call it res publica. We call it republic. Res publica means public matters. They had a constitution that they devised. It was not like the Greeks, who were democratic at that time. It was a government that was representative in nature. In other words, the people voted for representatives who represented them and who ruled on their behalf. Administrators called consuls. People who made laws, that was the Senate, and the people were the senators. Senators were former magistrates. They were appointed after they'd served as magistrates. This Roman Republican Constitution, if it sounds remotely familiar, elected representatives, Senate, things of that nature, I will tell you that the United States formed its constitution and its form of government based upon the Roman Republican Constitution. And there is a direct link between Republican Rome and the United States of America. The Republic was a glorious time for Rome. It was a time of honor. It was a time of the practice of these wonderful Roman values. And Rome expanded from just controlling one city of Rome to controlling Italy, to controlling eventually the whole western Mediterranean and the whole eastern Mediterranean area, until Rome had a vast empire. But it was done by many wars over a long period of time. And then Rome went through a civil war, a revolution. When the government became corrupt, there were factions, and the Romans, instead of fighting foreigners for conquest, once they had conquered about all they were going to take, although they still took some more later on, but at this point it seems to be pretty well at an end, they began to fight each other. And it was a terrible civil war that lasted for 100 years, and the leaders pretty well killed each other off. You may have heard of some of those leaders: Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, Marius, Sulla, Pompey the Great, Julius Caesar, Mark Antony. And finally, when it was all said and done, one man alone survived the civil war. After a great victory over his rival Mark Antony and Antony's wife, the Queen of Egypt, Cleopatra, a battle at Actium in 31 BC, the one person to survive it was Octavian, the grandnephew of Julius Caesar, who became known by the honorific title of Augustus, the respected one. He was the one who was in power when Jesus was born. Augustus had a decision to make. What is he going to do now that he is the sole survivor and he's virtually the ruler of the civilized world? I might say Augustus himself was a man who imbibed the old Roman values. He was extremely moral. When he was in power, he passed laws against divorce. He passed laws against adultery. He passed laws giving a bonus to couples who had a large family. And he enforced those laws even in his own family, when his own daughter and granddaughter were guilty of sexual improprieties. He exiled them. He was very sincere. He brought about a period of peace. The wars stopped. No more civil wars, no more wars with other countries, and he gave to the civilized world, which is the Roman Empire at this point, the longest period of peace in history. There has never been before, nor has there ever been since, a period of 200 years without a war. 2 centuries. It's called the Pax Romana, the Peace of Rome. He built an altar in Rome called the Ara Pacis, the altar of peace that celebrated that. He was a great ruler. But how is he going to rule? Is he going to keep the republic going? Well, the republic is dead. But he didn't want to come on with the impression that he has become a king or a dictator. So he kept the form of the republic. He kept the facade of the republic. He kept the terms of the republic. And it seemed as though the republic lived on. They still had a senate. They had consuls and praetors and quaestors and censors and all the others, and tribunes, and a senate, and an assembly for the common people. They had all of these things that they had before, but the real power was in Augustus, who called himself princeps, which means first citizen. He would say, I am primus inter pares, which in Latin means first among equals. I mean, we're all citizens, I'm just first. But the title that stuck with him was imperator, which is a word that means he who has the right to command an army, hence emperor. And it was very important that the army was always behind the emperor. From now on, the history of the Roman Empire goes from this point, which is 31 BC, until 1453 AD. That's when the Roman Empire finally fell. And so for the 1500 years, he who could control the army could control the state. And the fatal secret was that the army was the real power. They could make and unmake emperors, and if an emperor did not behave himself as they thought he should, they would remove him and replace him with somebody else. The government was officially called the Principate, but we know it as the Roman Empire. Now, that gives you some feel, I think, for the man who is ruling. I call him the greatest politician who ever lived. To be able to put together what he did, he was a tremendous politician. And it is interesting that the greatest politician who ever lived was ruling at the same time that the greatest man who ever lived our Lord Jesus Christ was born. Let me share with you something interesting in the experience of Augustus. As you know, Rome is built on 7 hills. The Palatine Hill is the oldest settlement. It goes back to around 2000 BC. There are other hills in Rome. There's the Esquiline and the Avetine and the Viminal and the Caelian and so forth. But one of them that sits perpendicular to the Palatine is called Capitoline Hill. In Washington, D.C., we speak of Capitol Hill. That's where they got it, from Rome, Capitol Hill. And on Capitol Hill, and by the way, where these two come together, down in the valley beneath, is a place called the Forum, and that was the center of government activity and temples and businesses and law courts and things like that were down there. The Senate building is still standing in the Roman Forum. But up on Capitol Hill were 2 buildings, 2 temples. One to Jupiter, who was the king of the gods, so that was the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus, and the other was to Juno, his wife, the queen of the gods. And so one day we find Octavian going to the temple of Juno, because at the temple of Juno we find a priestess who's called the Sibylline Oracle, the Sibylline priestess. Like the Greeks had the Delphic Oracle, the Romans had the Sibyl. The Sibyl kept books of prophecies where she foretold the future. Now, I'm going to read you from a 15th century account written in the 1400s. You might think maybe it isn't totally accurate, but something happened. In the time of Emperor Octavian, the senators, seeing him to be of such great beauty that none could look into his eyes, and of such great prosperity and peace that he made all the world render tribute to him, said to him, "We desire to worship you, because the Godhead is in you." And by the way, they did do that over his objection. But there developed a cult called Augustus et Roma, Augustus and Rome. And throughout the empire, buildings were built, like church buildings, called Augustaeum. And there people would come and worship the image of the emperor and would also have civic meetings. "We desire to worship you because the Godhead is in you. For if it were not so, all things would not prosper with you as they do." But he was reluctant and demanded a delay and called the Sibyl of Tibur to him. And he repeated all that the senators had said. She begged for 3 days' time, during which she kept a strict fast, and then answered him after the 3rd day, "These things, Lord Emperor, shall surely come to pass. Token of doom. The earth shall drip with sweat. From heaven shall come the King forevermore, and present in the flesh shall judge the world." And the other verses that follow. "And while Octavian diligently listened to the Sibyl, heaven opened, and a great brightness shone on him, and he saw in heaven a virgin, exceedingly fair, standing on an altar, holding a man-child in her arms. Octavian marveled greatly at this, and he heard a voice from heaven saying, 'This is the virgin who shall conceive the Savior of the world.' And again he heard another voice from heaven saying, 'This is the altar of the Son of God.' The emperor straightway fell to the ground and worshipped the Christ that should come. He showed this vision to the senators, and they likewise marveled exceedingly. The vision took place in the chamber of Emperor Octavian, where the church of Santa Maria and Capitolio is now, and where the friars minor are. Therefore it's called the Santa Maria and Ara Coeli, and there is a church by that name standing on that spot today. And around it the ruins of the Temple of Juno. Another day, when the people had decreed to call Octavian Lord, he immediately stopped them with his gesture and glance. He did not allow himself to be called Lord, even by his sons, saying, "Mortal I am, and you will not call me Lord." Would that all the Roman emperors had followed that procedure. Now, if that sounds a bit fantastic, that's a 15th century account, let me read you yet another account. In speaking of the church of Santa Maria and Ara Coeli, in the inn transept is an elegant edicula, that is, miniature temple, marking the spot where the Sibyl prophesied to Augustus that a virgin would bear a divine child who would overthrow the altars of the gods, whereupon the emperor set up an altar on the spot with the inscription, now on the triumphal arch, "Ecce aro primogeniti Dei," behold the altar of the firstborn of God. Clearly he did build an altar there, and something happened that caused him to build it. Augustus ruled very capably from 31 BC to AD 14. After he died, his stepson Tiberius was the next ruler from AD 14 to AD 37. Tiberius was a rather gloomy person, not a very pleasant person. Tiberius happened to be the emperor at the time of the crucifixion of our Lord. There is a statement that the earliest Christian writer after the age of the apostles, the earliest of the fathers, Justin Martyr, says, he claims that someone had preached the gospel to Tiberius, perhaps a Roman soldier, and that Tiberius was convinced that the gospel was true. This is, of course, subsequent to the death of Christ and the resurrection of Christ. He was convinced it was true and was going to present it to the Senate, but failed to do so. Perhaps the reason he failed to do so is that he left town for fear of his life and lived the last 10 years of his life on the island of Capri near Naples. After Tiberius died in 37, he was succeeded by Gaius, whose name is otherwise Caligula, Little Boots, and Little Boots was not too stable mentally, and finally was assassinated after doing some very strange things that we will not go into. He was succeeded by Claudius, his uncle. Claudius is mentioned twice in the Bible. Once for driving the Jews out of Rome. I assume they were particularly obstreperous at that time. And the other because a famine occurred during his reign, was prophesied by Agabus. Those are both in the book of Acts. Claudius reigned very capably. He's the one who annexed Britain. And then came Nero, who was his stepson and another insane emperor. What we want to notice about Nero is he was the first emperor ever to persecute Christians. Nero had already lost interest in ruling and considered himself to be the world's greatest singer and actor, and was going all over the empire putting on performances and concerts. It probably happened that he was out of town at the time, but he was blamed for it at any rate, because in the year 64 there was a fire in Rome. And much of Rome was wooden apartment buildings, tenement buildings, and it went up very quickly, and people were dispossessed of their homes, were burned out of their homes. Someone claimed that in the silhouette of the flames they saw Nero playing on the lyre, not the fiddle, the lyre. Probably not true. As a matter of fact, Nero, who was capable of having feeling, was moved with compassion and set up a tent city on his grounds for the homeless people. It was true that he was planning to build a great palace, which he never quite got finished, called the Domus Aurea, the House of Gold. And he was accused of burning down all these apartment buildings to make room for his golden house. But he began to be blamed for the fire, and in order to take the blame off himself, he suggested, aha, I'll tell you who did it. I didn't do it. The Christians did it. The Christians did it. Now, by this time, there was a large church of Jesus Christ in Rome. We know there was one there when Paul wrote his letter. He wrote to the Roman church. The Roman letter was written to the church there. And we know from what we read in the Bible that they met in the house of Aquila and Priscilla, and actually we know where that house was located. And there's a church that's standing on that site today, so we can say this is where the church met in Rome. And it was a large church. There were some misunderstandings about Christians. Not everybody liked the Christians. They were a little different. And because the Christians worshipped to themselves, the pagans got to thinking that maybe they were just a little bit peculiar. They heard them talking about loving their brothers and sisters, and they took that in the worst possible way. Remember, Romans are very moral, and so the very thought of incest was repugnant to them. But they thought maybe that's what they're doing, that they get together and have incestuous relations, their brothers and sisters. They also heard the Christians talking about eating the flesh and drinking the blood of somebody. Of course, that's a reference to the communion service. But some of them said, well, I think they're cannibals. They're killing babies and drinking their blood and eating their flesh and things like this. But perhaps the most offensive thing to the Romans was the fact that by this point, even though Augustus did not want it, most of the emperors were worshipped, and some of them were worshipped while they were still alive, and it became customary, as an American would salute the flag or stand up when the national anthem is played, that you would offer incense to the image of the emperor. But the Jews and the Christians refused to do it. Now somehow the Jews got by. They had money even then. They had position, particularly through the Herods. The Herods seemed to buy them some influence. But the Christians didn't have a Herod on their side. And so consequently, Because the Christians would not worship the image of the emperor, they were accused of being treasonous and not at all patriotic. And so Nero could say, these people did it, and these people who claim that they're the light of the world, we'll make them the light of the world. So Nero took these Christians into his garden at night when he had his wild parties, and he tied them to a stake and poured pitch on their bodies and set fire to them so they would become torches to illuminate his garden parties at night. And he dressed them up in sheep skins and turned them loose in arena with wild animals. There, by the way, on the Vatican Hill is where he had a racetrack, and he would put these Christians to death at the Vatican, where now St. Peter's is built, and Christians were, in fact, buried there. Nero eventually overextended himself, and the army turned against him. By the way, this persecution was a local one, only in Rome. Later on, an emperor by the name of Domitian persecuted the church. Domitian was the younger son of Vespasian. I should mention that Vespasian was the emperor responsible for destroying the city of Jerusalem in AD 70, fulfilling the prophecy of our Lord when he said that Jerusalem would fall. It would be the worst catastrophe that ever happened to the world, and not one stone would be left standing upon another in the temple. And Vespasian's son Titus, who was in charge of the army, had them actually dismantle the temple piece by piece. And the treasure from the temple went back to Rome and was placed in a special temple that Vespasian built to display those items, called the Temple of Peace. Well, his younger son was Domitian. He was also mentally unstable, persecuted the church, and particularly the Apostle John. We think that John went to the island of Patmos under Diocletian's persecution, and there wrote the book of Revelation. After Domitian, there's a time of some very capable emperors, and Rome reaches its high point in the 2nd century. There were 5 of these capable emperors, the second of whom was Trajan, who extended the Roman Empire to its largest extent. During the time of Trajan, we have some interesting correspondence between him and Pliny the Younger, who was a governor of Bithynia, which is in what is now Turkey, the north part of Turkey. And in this correspondence, Pliny says to the emperor, these Christians, I've investigated them, and they really don't seem to be bad people. They get together and they sing hymns to Christ as a god. They meet on a certain day of the week, and they seem to do good works for each other and all this. They don't seem to be particularly bad, but yet I know they must be seditious. And so my policy is that I don't go looking for Christians, but if someone turns in a Christian and accuses a person of being a Christian, then I call them in and I say, will you revile Jesus Christ and denounce him, and will you worship the image of the emperor? Now, if that Christian will do that, and he will revile Christ and recant his faith, then I'll let him go. But if he insists on persisting, then I'll put him to death. Is that all right? And Trajan writes back and says, that's fine, Pliny, that's a good policy. And that was kind of the policy that was followed. You were okay until somebody who didn't like you turned you in to the government. Now, the first time that we see an empire-wide persecution was about 250 under Decius. At that time, the Roman Empire, this is now the 3rd century, not the 2nd century, which was a good century, but the 3rd century was a terrible century for Rome. Rome was coming apart, and because the Romans were desperately trying to achieve unity, they saw the Christians as divisive because they worshipped another god than Caesar, an emperor. And so Decius issued an empire-wide persecution, and everywhere Christians were persecuted. They had just started building church buildings, but they were all demolished. All the clergy were arrested. Bibles were rounded up and set fire to, Bible burnings. They tried to destroy all the Bibles. They didn't do it. And this is when the Christians had to go underground into the catacombs where they buried their dead to take refuge. And it got worse and worse and worse and worse until we have the time of Diocletian and Galerius, where it reaches its maximum point. But Galerius, one time in 311, became very ill, and even though he was the worst enemy of the Christians prayed for their worst enemy. They prayed for Galerius' health. What a loving thing to do. And when Galerius saw a copy of their prayer, he said, I'm going to lift the persecution, which he did in 311, and there was no more persecution. After Galerius came Constantine, who saw a vision of a cross in the sky, and above the cross the words in Latin, in hoc signo vinces, in this sign you will conquer. He was preparing to fight his rival, and he had them scratch the Christian sign on their shields. They won. Constantine became a Christian. Christianity became legal. And a few years later, in 381, Christianity became the only legal religion of the empire. As we move to the time of Christianity becoming the only legal religion, Christianity was developing and growing its own hierarchy, its own structure, its own organization. And what we see is that the Christians will take the structure of the Roman Empire and appropriate it. For instance, Diocletian had divided up the empire into dioceses under vicars. And if you listen, those terms are a part of the language of the Roman Catholic Church. The emperor had seen himself as the Pontifex Maximus, as the high priest who was responsible for maintaining the peace of the gods. And now the Bishop of Rome begins to take the very position that the Roman emperor had, that it is his responsibility to maintain the peace in the church and the right relationship with God. Even the Roman Senate, that had a responsibility for overseeing the government, now was given the responsibility of electing or selecting the popes, as we see the papacy developing. So there is a tremendous interaction of the Roman government and an influence and an impact of the whole Roman governmental structure on the development of the church.